Well, welcome to our Wednesday's Bible study at lunchtime. I am David and I am the senior pastor here at Highland, and I'm so glad that you have joined us today. We are going through the book of Hebrews, looking at how Jesus is greater than anyone or anything. And so today, we're going to look at how Jesus is greater or has the better covenant. And we're going to be in chapter 8 and 9 today. So if you have your Bibles, go ahead and turn to Hebrews chapter 8 and 9. And as you're doing that, in my office, I have still sitting on the floor. It hasn't been hung yet, but it's been there since I've been here at Highland. But one day it'll be hung. But on my floor, sitting on the wall there, is a reproduction of the Declaration of Independence. And not only do I love that document because I'm an American and the grace that God has given us because we live in this wonderful country, but this document means a lot to our country. And in fact, even one of the signers there, I keep it there, just his name is Stephen Hopkins, and I don't know if we're related. I like to think we are somewhere down the line. I think we are because his handwriting is about as horrible as mine. But it's sitting there. Now, this is a reproduction. And this may mean a lot to me, but it's not the real thing, is it? It shows us, it's a copy of what the real thing is that is held in the rotunda at the National Archives that I would love to be able to go see one day. And one day I'll hope to go see that. And as I look at my wall, I like looking at the copy of it, but I really want to one day go see the real thing. There's nothing like the real thing. Well, that's what the writer of Hebrews is going to talk about today. He's going to compare two covenants, the old covenant with the new covenant. The old covenant was great. It was good, but there's a better one. In fact, Hebrews 7:22, we've already looked at that, but it talks about how Jesus is the guarantor of a better covenant. So we want to ask the question, why is Jesus' covenant, the new one, so much better than the old one? Why is it greater than the old? Well, the writer of Hebrews is going to talk about that in chapters 8 and 9. So why don't you look there with me, because I've highlighted three areas that he is comparing the two covenants. Now, and I guess before we jump into this discussion, we probably need to talk just really briefly, just define the word covenant. We hear it a lot, but we may not know exactly what that means in the Bible. The word covenant is not unique just to the Bible, although it is all through the Bible. It's how we understand the Bible. If you ever heard the terminology covenant history, it's how the Bible is laid out. But it was used in all kinds of different antiquity writings and things like that. And really all the simplistic meaning behind the word covenant is that it is a binding agreement. It is a binding agreement. There were all kinds of different covenants in the ancient world. And it is a covenant that is binding two parties to one another. And it's relationship based. There was a relational aspect to this covenant. In fact, this is why God uses and says the covenant of marriage to help us understand his relationship with humankind. Is because you have a man and a woman, and they are bound together for better, for worse, through sickness and health and all of those things. It's a relational binding agreement between two parties. And the covenant began in Genesis chapter 12, where Abraham comes into covenant with God. And it continues on through the Old Testament and into the New Testament. So in all of it now, the covenant is regulated by what we call the law of God. The 10 Commandments would be the 10 statements, the 10 words of that. But it did fill out more than that. But the whole covenant is regulated by the law. And even in the New Testament, when we get to the New Testament, we can't say that, well, the old covenant was regulated by the law and the new covenant is regulated by grace. That's not true. It was great. All of it was grace-based. Israel didn't do anything to earn God's grace toward them to come into covenant, that God wanted to come into covenant with them. It's all grace-based, and even Old Testament saints would have understood that. The difference is what we're going to see, and I'll go ahead and give you a little bit of it, and I think you already know what's coming, but the difference is, whereas the law regulated in the Old Testament and in both the Old Covenant and the New Covenant is regulated by God's law, the regulation was fulfilled through the works of people in the Old Covenant, whereas now the works of Christ has been the thing that has fulfilled the regulation of the law in the New Covenant. That's the difference. That's the big difference. It's a profound difference. The finished work of Christ. He has done everything. Now, before I get too far ahead of us, let's look at the three comparisons that the writer is going to show us in this part of Hebrews, how Jesus is the great high priest of a better covenant. So in the first one that he's going to compare, we're going to compare that the Old Covenant was a physical covenant and the New Covenant is a spiritual covenant. Look with me in verse 1 of chapter 8. Now, the point in what we are saying is this: we have such a high priest, one who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven, a minister in the holy places, in the true tent that the Lord set up, not man. For every high priest is appointed to offer gifts and sacrifices. Thus, it is necessary for this priest also to have something to offer. Now, if he were on earth, he would not be a priest at all, since there are priests who offer gifts according to the law. That's Jesus he's talking about. There's already a priesthood on earth, he says, but Jesus is in heaven here. And now look at verse 5. They serve, both the priest and all the temple and the tabernacle and all that was constructed, they serve a copy and shadow of the heavenly things. For when Moses was about to erect the tent, he was instructed by God, saying, "See that you make everything according to the pattern that was shown you on the mountain." Now, what we're looking at here is that we see that first and foremost that he's showing a physical aspect, and he's going to talk a lot about that in just a few minutes, a little bit more about that in chapter 9, but there's a physical aspect to the Old Covenant. It was worked out physically in the natural world. I mean, Moses was commanded to erect a tabernacle, and it was, something you could touch, you could feel, and he was to make it how? To make it just like the copies that were shown him, or just the dimensions and everything that God said. Where's God getting that? Well, he's getting it from the one that he's comparing it to, the spiritual side of everything, the one that is in heaven. And in verse 6, he says, "But as it is, Christ has obtained a ministry that is much more excellent than the old covenant, as he mediates, the covenant he mediates is better, since it is enacted on better promises." Now, so here's what the writer of Hebrews is trying to get to when he's talking about the two covenants. In the first and foremost is that one is a physical covenant and one is a spiritual covenant that is enacted and upheld by Christ. One is on earth, one is in heaven, which we'll get to in just a few moments. But at the very basic level of all of this is that we have this covenant, and it's regulated. We have these rules that we have to follow in the old covenant, and we have sacrifices and things like that, which is why the tabernacle was constructed, so that God could reside there, so that man could live in communion with God. But how do you live in communion with a holy God? Well, we have sin, and there has to be these continual sacrifices. See, this whole sin issue is really what kind of pulls down the old covenant. Because even though it's physical, we understand that sin is not merely a physical problem. It is a spiritual problem. It doesn't go away just because we sacrifice something. The old covenant did that. But they would have to continue to sacrifice things year after year after year to cover those sins. But there are going to be new sins that come up. So when we try to deal with physical problems, or when we try to deal with spiritual problems in physical ways, it never has the long-term effect that we want it to have, that we intend for it to have. And so we needed a spiritual solution to spiritual problems, which is what that verse 6 is talking about. Christ has obtained a ministry that is as much excellent than the old covenant. That is much more excellent than the old covenant. He mediates is better, since it is enacted on better promises. So Christ is our solution to our sin problem. We don't need a physical solution to something that is really a heart problem. We need a spiritual solution to it that is a heart problem. And only Jesus can provide that. Only his finished work, only his regulation of the law through his death on the cross can provide that for us. And so he's comparing this physical to the spiritual, the problem and solution that the Old Covenant and the New Covenant offers. Now, he mentions that these better promises. So let's look at that real quick. In the next section, we're going to see how he's going to compare the Old Covenant and the New Covenant in terms of one being earthly and one being heavenly. And so in the earthly one, look down in chapter, we've already read it, but I'm going to remind us of it. Verse 5, they serve a copy of the shadow of the heavenly things. For when Moses was about to erect the tent, he was instructed by God, see that you make everything according to the pattern that was shown you on the mountain. So all of this is coming from God in heaven here. And then chapter 9, verse 1, now even the first covenant had regulations for worship and an earthly place of holiness. So in this part, he's going to talk a lot through chapter 9, the first part of chapter 9, about the earthly place of the tabernacle of worship. And he's going to talk to you about what that looked like, the tent of meeting, or the tent, how it's constructed, and then the holy place, and then the most holy or the holy of holies place. And he's kind of giving you a guided tour of the construction of this tabernacle, of this place that God wanted him to build, Moses to build, and that people would meet with God. And those are important things. The difference, though, is that they're just mere shadows. They're mere copies, they're reflections of the real thing that really matters, which is the heavenly aspect to what God is doing. Now, you may be wondering, why in the world does this matter, whether we have an earthly or a heavenly tabernacle or place of meeting with God? Well, one is temporary. Earthly is temporary. Heavenly is eternal. And the problem here is, what is the effects of sin? What does the Bible say the effect of sin is? It is the wages of sin is death, right? Both physically and spiritually. One day, we all die. That's a problem. That means if the only covenant that we have, the only binding relationship that we have is only for the here and now, death is going to separate us. Death is going to take us away from the Lord Jesus. Well, we know that is not true. And so, in fact, he even says that in 9:27. And just as it appointed for man to die once, and after that comes judgment. The problem is that we all die. And we need a covenant binding and place to meet with God that is greater than death itself, that death cannot separate us from. And so we need something that's not just temporary, not just temporal in the here and now. We need something much better, something that's going to last for eternity, which is what Jesus is offering. Verse 28, so Christ, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time, not to deal with sin, but to save those who eagerly are waiting for him. So the temple, or the temple tabernacle is, it was physical, it was here earthly, it was temporal, it served a purpose, but the greater purpose is what Jesus has done, the heavenly side of everything, the eternal side of everything, that nothing is going to separate us from the one who has loved us and given himself for us. Now I want to show you the last part, because the last one we're going to see is that one is obsolete and the other will never be obsolete. One is obsolete and the other will never be obsolete. Now, the old covenant is the one that he's going to talk about as being obsolete. Look at chapter 8, verse 13. Let's back up to there. In speaking of a new covenant, he makes the first one, that's the old covenant, obsolete. And what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. One of the most annoying parts of technology is the moment that you buy that brand new computer and spend all of those thousands of dollars, 2 years from now, most of that computer will be obsolete. And you will need what? An update. Well, Jesus offers this better promise, is that in him, the covenant that he has secured, the binding relationship that we have with him, it never needs an updating. It is the permanent updating. The updated version. It will never grow old. It will never run dry. It will never go out. It will never stop working. How do we know that? Well, because he tells us in go to Hebrews chapter 9, verse 12 through 15. And he, that's Jesus, entered once for all into the holy places, not by means of the blood of goats and calves, but by means of his own blood, thus securing an eternal redemption, one that is effective forever and ever and ever. For if the blood of goats and bulls and the sprinkling of defiled persons with the ashes of a heifer sanctify for the purification of the flesh, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, purify our conscience from dead works to serve the living God? Therefore, he is the mediator of a new covenant, so that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance, since a death has occurred that redeems them from the transgressions committed under the first covenant. One is going to end in death. The old covenant, as good as it was, it would only show us our need, how much we break God's law, and how much we need a Savior, but it only ends in death. Jesus' covenant, the new covenant, the better covenant, the greater covenant, the one that binds us together in him in this relationship, well, it's been secured. It's been paid for. It is effective forever. It will never go out. It will never stop working. It will sanctify. It will redeem eternally. In fact, those verses that we just read, the word eternal was used 3 times in 5 verses. There is an eternal aspect to Jesus' finished work. He has done what it takes to keep us in this binding relationship with God forever and ever and ever. Where one, the old covenant results in death, the new covenant results in salvation. Salvation forever. Well, I hope this has been a lot today, but I hope that this will give you a few things to think about this week as we're continuing. We're going to be wrapping up Hebrews here soon, but I hope you've enjoyed this study in Hebrews on, especially looking at today, the Old Covenant versus the New Covenant. And if you ever have any questions, just type those into the comment bar. I'd love to be able to address some of those later on in the week. Well, I hope you guys have a wonderful week, and may the Lord bless you.